G'day, brothers and sisters. This is the other Paul, and we are here for an excellent, long-awaited stream with new special guests and fellow Anglican Sean Luke. Mate, how are you going today?
I'm doing well. It's good to be here. Thank you for having me on.
No problem, King. What time is it where you are? Curiosity.
So yeah, it's 6 p.m. Central, and it looks like it's there. It looks like it's daylight there.
That's right. It is a nice 11 a.m. morning right now. So
Okay, wow.
that's how most of my streams go because I like to appease the Yankee crowd. So I tend to do morning time streams. Sometimes there's exceptions, but it actually works really well. I do kind of like this as like a morning thing. So yeah, it kind of gets the day going. But
Yes.
yes, we are here now for an epic, really, really awesome stream here where we will be giving an overall good detail too, but otherwise an overall case for the apostolic faith as we understand it, common across Anglicans, Romanists, Easterners, evangelicals, you name it, the core apostolic faith over and against the claims of the various Gnostic groups, Marcionites, so on and so forth, taken as a whole. And this was particularly inspired because of from Sean's own discussion with Michael Lofton on Reason Theology, who tried to play a sort of devil's advocate position, and ultimately, from how I understood it, tried to argue that historical testimony will not sufficiently raise the apostolic faith over that of various Gnostic claims, because they could ask various skeptical kinds of arguments and punch holes in the certainty of apostolic faith claims. Whereas the thing that can set it apart is that one has a community with an apostolic succession of ordinations going back to the apostles, and that this will set this apart. So this presentation will fundamentally be a positive presentation, so not just like a direct response to Lofton, but it will be, in some ways, will be an indirect response to attempts of what I would say very hyper-skeptical attacks on the apostolic faith. And so we hope this is going to be an extremely useful resource for people in all sorts of levels of discussions. This could be applied in many areas, whether it be with the claims of other actual skeptics who try to say that, oh, the Orthodox party was just the guys who came out on top. They're not actually in good connection with Christ, or any people who actually are Gnostics who try to forward the claims of their old progenitors. But right before we get to that, I'm going to give a very quick thank you to my legendary financial supporters. Yes, I know, not a very fancy list, but this is what I do right now because it's actually a lot of effort to put in the whole fancy scroll thing with the old font. I'll get back to that eventually when I have a more efficient system. But otherwise, you absolute legends here who are supporting the channel, thank you so much. And if anyone here sees value in what I'm doing, if you take from it, if you are financially stable, supporting your local church, and you want to support me, head to the link below at Subscribestar to become a supporter. All benefits all levels of support get really cool benefits. And so you can support us for as little as $4.50 US dollars a month. And you get some really cool benefits with that, including most recently for people of all tiers, semi-regular private supporter streams, which are very fun and spicy as well. So thank you everybody who is supporting me right now. And I do hope anybody else watching will consider supporting, so long as you're all good on the financial area as well and you're supporting your local church. I do try to really emphasize that. Don't support me if you're not already supporting your church, whether financially or with your own human services. So thank you so much, supporters. And now back to the content. Sean, so you're a first-time guest here. I think a decent number of people in my audience will know who you are because you make some other really good content elsewhere that I've seen. But otherwise, could you introduce yourself, who you are, what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I recently just finished my master's in systematic theology from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School.
Hey, okay.
I'm finishing my MDiv by the end of this semester, and I work as an admissions counselor at Trinity. Yeah, my main interests are in systematic theology. Theology, I call it, is that systematic theology is the practice of reading the world in the light of the Word, trying to cohere the doctrines of Scripture as a coherent lens through which we interpret reality. And within that domain, as my title suggests, my YouTube channel, aesthetics is sort of the heart of what I'm interested in, even though I cover other things. Yeah, I hope that this will be helpful. I am, as the name suggests, an Anglican with a kind of reformational Catholic emphasis. I really try to emphasize both reformational Catholic. And that's, yeah, it's a little bit about me. My channel, Anglican Aesthetics. You can follow me there. And I'm going to start putting out a little bit more content on that channel.
Excellent, excellent. That's right. And Sean's channel is linked down in the description below, people. So if you want to subscribe to him, and he does make some very, very good content. I like to watch him when he uploads new things. You can go subscribe down below as a fellow Anglican. But now we're going to get right into this presentation. So again, as a summary, is going to be an overall defense of the apostolic faith. This is largely... I'm largely going to let Sean, if he's keen, largely let him guide the discussion with his evidences and his reasonings. But otherwise, I'll hope to be able to supplement my own data or reasoning as well as it comes about, and more or less let this be a kind of mix of a structured presentation and conversation. So we'll have structure with what we do according to the order as Sean wants it, but then also we'll have some free-flowing discussion within that as well. And of course, as usual, there'll be a Q&A right at the end of this. By the way, Sean, do you have a hard time limit, or are you pretty free?
Probably free for the next 2.5 hours. I'm free.
Oh, easy. Perfect. So as long as we can get through that, that'll be good. There'll be a Q&A at the very end, which, by the way, people who either super chat or if you're a financial supporter of any level, your questions will be prioritized first. So another nice incentive for support. But anyway, before we begin, since we're both fellow Anglicans, and something which I want to start doing more with my content, before we begin today, since it's going to be an endeavor of historical study, and we believe, of course, that everything we do is for God's glory. I myself in particular take it extremely seriously that a man who enters into historical investigation does so with rigorous principles and desire for going to the truth. Because I genuinely believe, not that every time someone makes a historical error it's a sin, but I do believe that can be an occasion for sin if someone is so flagrantly how should we say, undisciplined and disregarding of proper standards for historical investigation. That can be a sin. And even when it's not sin, it's ultimately good that we would be oriented towards the truth of history. So we're gonna open up with a little thing I personally wrote myself called the Collect for Historians. So since me and Sean are both Anglicans, we're gonna pray this over this entire session, so that by God's grace we are guided towards the truth and we make a good case. So let us begin. Sean, the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Almighty God, who knowest and decreest all things, lead us this day in these our inquiries of times past. Grant, merciful Father, that we assert not fact where there is none, nor praise where it is unmerited, nor judgment where it is undeserved, but that the fruits of our study be only the story which thou hast written before the foundations of the world, through Jesus Christ our Lord, to whom with thee and the Holy Spirit be the honor and the glory, both now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, brother.
All good.
Yeah.
All good. Now, let us commence. So I want to begin with, before going into big detail, I want you to give us, actually, I think the order first was, to go over some epistemological issues first. Especially, this is probably the biggest area where I do the indirect response with Lofton, because, again, he was playing devil's advocate, so he's not actually some guy who's necessarily a hyper skeptic, Gnostic or whatever. But his devil's advocacy does show some epistemological issues which need to be dealt with first, which I do believe, when properly addressed, will somewhat kneecap the various attempts of devil's advocacy against the apostolic faith. Do you have any such observations you want to make first, Sean? Or
Yeah, well, so I think first it's important to just get clear on terms. So what do we mean when we say the apostolic faith?
Yep.
I'll give more evidence for this, but by the apostolic faith, we want to talk about the faith that the apostles delivered to the churches. So what is the body of teaching that the apostles gave on? And that's really important, right? Because we can think of the apostolic deposit in a number of ways. One could think that the apostolic deposit includes performances of the gospel. So with this idea of performance, if I say there's a train coming and you see a train coming, you would enact that command by responding to it and hopefully getting out of the way. I want to say that performances, while they're enactments of the apostolic deposit, they're not the apostolic deposit. The deposit is the specific body of teachings. So we're asking a historical question here. What is the body of teachings that the apostles gave on to the churches, and how do we identify it?
Yeah, that makes plenty of sense. So we got to be very precise here. And something which I did actually appreciate with Lofton is how he distinguishes between the questions of what did the apostles preach versus what did Christ preach, because it's a fair point to bring up that with certain opponents of the faith, they would claim that the apostles, whether some or all of them, didn't accurately represent the teachings of Christ, and so that's something to address as well. Something we'll definitely get into today, and I have a bit myself to present on that. But likewise, I think the core power of this sort of devil's advocate, very hyper skeptical case against the apostolic faith, and not that Lofton was saying, "Oh, therefore there's no evidence for it," but just that the historical testimony is insufficient to raise the the divine pedigree of the apostolic faith over and against the various Gnostic sects. So just to be fair with his case there. However, I think a large chunk of his skeptical inquiries, devil's advocacy, it relies on the assumption that any and all skepticism and any and all skeptical questions are warranted. It doesn't actually consider that there may be a burden for warrant for skepticism and for skeptical questions. So we can think of a scenario, for example. It's so funny. Discussions on historical like epistemology always happen with like a car accident analogy somewhere. That always happens. Like I even hear that with analogies for gospel authorship. Like, oh, it's like 4 different perspectives of a car accident. So it's so weird. It always comes with this. But let's do the cliche. Car accident happens. Freshly just happened right now. We got a dozen plus independent witnesses. They all immediately give their statements. They are all very consistent with what happened with the car accident, including that there was a car accident, all given their statements. Let's say 12 plus witnesses to get some numeric fun happening. All independent witnesses, all just happened. Then suddenly someone comes out of left field, maybe just comes right onto the street, and he starts to ask questions. But how do these guys actually know they really saw a car accident? Or rather, how do you know that these witnesses are being truthful? Maybe they all just lied. Maybe they all just pretended there was something and they moved a pre-existing car wreck into place and played a really loud bang sound. Like, how do you know? How do you know this and that? We can very reasonably say that on the balance of probabilities, that skepticism is utterly unwarranted. We rely on basic presuppositions like the general reliability of human testimony. And in this case, we have such a very solid establishment of human testimony cohering and demonstrating a historical fact. We have a genuine moral certainty, the best we can ask for. And so for someone to come and ask skeptical questions, I'd say that they don't have the right to just assert their skeptical questions as something which needs to be answered in order for the testimony to be accepted. They actually have to give warrant. Why are you asking those questions? Why should we accept those questions? They need to provide something like, say, for example, well, I can hardly even think of something. Maybe some weird alien ship projecting a massive hologram on the scene or whatever. Maybe that can call some things into question. But anything less than that, we are otherwise obligated, I reckon, with the canons of historical method to accept such strong testimony. And skeptical questions, they would need to be demonstrated as warranted before anyone would be obligated to answer them. Do you agree with that? What do you think?
Yeah. So Cameron Bertuzzi on his channel has a great interview with Glenn Peoples, who plays, this does Abraham or does exist role. In that discussion,
sorry,
he tries to be a Lincoln. Yeah, and also
you cut out a little bit there.
That out so it doesn't change. Right.
Okay.
Let's see.
So could you? Okay, you seem to be.
Hopefully, I'm also trying to.
I think you're good.
Am I better now?
Yeah, you're better now.
Okay.
So I guess just from the start about Peoples.
Yeah. So on Cameron Bertuzzi's channel, Capturing Christianity, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, Glenn Peoples comes on and he tries to be an A-Lincolnist. Which is someone who denies the existence of Abraham Lincoln. Satire of the Jesus mythicist movement. Now, what he points out, I think brilliantly, is that you can raise, in theory, skeptical questions to whether Abraham Lincoln existed and what did he actually say. But we can reasonably answer those on historical grounds. We actually don't need an infallible authority structure. in order to be able to answer those. So in this this sort of exercise of showing the apostolic faith, we want to give a way of showing how we can resource the Christian community, that's important, but that functions in this mode of historical inquiry, and we can come to rationally justified historical conclusions using standard methods that we would in any other historical question.
Yeah, 100% true. I remember that A Lincolnist thing. I think I saw it before Glenn Peoples did his thing, but I just remember first encountering it, and it's so funny because you can even when they go the angle of comparing Abraham Lincoln with JFK, which there's a lot of really funny and scary parallels between them. So the case for mythicism can be made very well for JFK, and the only real answer to it, which we'd 100% agree, is that who cares if there's a lot of parallels? That doesn't mean fiction, because we have lots of reliable historical testimony to the facts of these things, which we'd say, amen, 100%. That's how you escape the rut of hyperskepticism, and that'd basically be my answer to such hyperskeptical attacks on the apostolic faith. And I'd also add, as a last thing before we really begin, Lofton's solution, so again, this is the most where we're going to be addressing Lofton. Otherwise, it's going to be our own thing, presentation otherwise. But otherwise, his solution of putting the apostolic faith a step above the Gnostics, of a material line of ordinations in a present community back to the apostles, as that separating the communities today, the apostolic faith from the Gnostics. I'd simply say, how does that really achieve anything? How does that, especially since your claims of continuity of ordinations also rely on not just historical data, but the same historical data as you yourself were appealing to? And so why couldn't the Gnostics say the exact same thing? Like, oh, how do you know with absolute certainty that your community is really in ordination continuity all the way back to the apostles? Because actually there were historic Gnostics, and I think I might get into this a little bit later, but there were actually historic Gnostics who claimed their own form of apostolic succession from the apostles. So if by the same token where Lofton may say, oh, well, but the Marcionites claim to have the authentic scriptures of Paul, so how do you know that they're false and you're right? We could say the exact same thing. How do you know your apostolic succession is right and not of the various Gnostic sects? Because they did claim a form of apostolic succession. Even the Gnostic heresiarch Ptolemy, 2nd century, in his letter to Flora, he explicitly uses the term apostolic succession. That the teachings he received and the letter recipient Flora will one day get, it was derived from apostolic succession. And so we can ask the exact same very skeptical questions with regard to that solution. Do you have anything to say on that? Or
yeah, and I believe it's either Ignatius or Polycarp pointed out that Valentinianism stems from Valens, who was a priest. He was a presbyter. And so there was someone from within the Christian community who eventually adopted Gnosticism and in that sense apostatized. So I think, and beyond even addressing Michael Lofton, as Paul pointed out, people will, you still actually hear this claim. I just heard this claim in a coffee shop a few weeks ago, where the church suppressed these Gnostic gospels. And,
of course.
the Gnostic gospels have a greater claim to what Jesus really said. So what we want to do here is show that claims like that are also just unreasonable.
Yep. 100% true. 100% true. So I'm glad we, so more or less got those basic issues out of the way. I will really quickly before we move on, read this one quote from actually one of my favorite books on historical method, which I always recommend to people if they can get it, because it's hard to find. It's an old one, A Guide to Historical Method by Jesuit priest, actually, Father Gilbert Garrigan, from the 1940s and 50s. And he actually writes on this issue of human testimony. Right after a section, he did a whole section outlining the various ways in which human testimony can err. He then actually flips it over in order to put away any idea of hyperskepticism. He writes the following on pages 240 and 241, just one paragraph. The errors to which testimony as a basis of history is often liable make it necessary to consider the question of the respective credibility of the various types of formal sources. This, however, is not to endorse in any way a spirit of skepticism or to deny the possibility of certainty in history. On the contrary, such inquiry will make it possible to bring to light the subjective influences which affect the perception and reproduction of historical facts, and with this knowledge in hand, to extract the kernel of the facts from the shell. The sound criteria provided by methodology for arriving at truth in history only confirm the plain fact of experience that happenings observed by competent witnesses can be reported by them exact and according to substantial truth. And a certain little bit after this, he says, pertinent here is Paley's well-known dictum that the usual character of human testimony is substantial truth under circumstantial variety. And so I think this is I'd say that this is the necessary core presupposition we need to approach this with, not just this topic, but all historical investigation in general. And not even just that, but just daily human life. We work, even self-professed very major skeptics, we work with the presumption that human testimony is, in general, perhaps even on the default, reliable, and that we can act upon it reliably for whatever ends we need. And so this is a necessary thing to approach the historical data with. And when we just this one acknowledgement of one presupposition alone, I believe is enough to basically demonstrate the claims of the apostolic faith. Because once we get to the volumes of material available, that's when things will really kick off. Okay, now on to the main section. So, Sean, could you give us a broad overview of your case and key evidences?
Yes. Yeah, so first I'm going to argue that my definition of the apostolic faith, we can tell from the sources, is the one that the church used. I'm going to try to spend just a little bit of time on that. And I'll also link a Google Doc and a comment or something like that, so you can also follow and see this outline. On historical,
sorry, Sean, you've cut up a bit.
Etc. Nation.
Sorry about that. Cut up a bit there.
That we can tell. Am I a little bit better now?
Yeah, you seem fine. You seem fine now.
Okay, cool. Yeah, just always feel free to let me know if my stream gets a little bit.
We'll do.
Yeah, so we can identify on historical grounds the accuracy of the teaching of Irenaeus, Ignatius, Polycarp, etc., as representing the teaching of the apostles as opposed to the Gnostics. And so some of those historical features, I'll argue, will be textually, the unity of Old Testament and New Testament teaching. That will be relevant to showing a continuity between the church's Jewishness and the gospel that they proclaim. I'm also going to show how the Gnostic Gospels explicitly reject things that we know Second Temple Jews would have held. They hold to specific teachings, which I'll explain the sort of Gnostic system. And then finally, I want to argue on historical grounds that while apostolic succession has some function, we have to be careful about how we employ it. So we can tell from the continuity between the direct disciples of the apostles, the teaching that comes through Irenaeus, as opposed to the teaching that comes through the Gnostics. Those who sat at the feet of the apostles are conveying what they heard from the apostles. And so on that basis, which is a historical observation that even an agnostic could affirm, we can say that the gospel that the church has proclaimed is substantively, in its essence and core, what was received from the apostles.
Yep.
Great. So basically, I'm going to work from sort of multiple attestation of what the apostolic faith was, and then I'm going to argue that we have good historical reasons, to look at the communities that were proximate to the apostles, and then make a case for their accurate transmission of the apostolic faith as opposed to the Gnostic communities.
Excellent. All right, let's get to it. Bring us the first evidence.
Great. So what is the apostolic faith? How do we know Paul and I aren't just sort of throwing out a definition that the early church wouldn't have held to? So first, Irenaeus, he wrote a book. He was a bishop, lived around 180 AD, and he wrote a book called Against Heresies. He's specifically actually attacking Gnosticism. Broadly Gnosticism. And he gives us a really helpful sketch of the Gnostic system. We'll go into that. But I want to focus on what he argues the faith of the sort that opposed.
Sorry, you're cutting up bad. You're cutting up very bad.
Themselves wise. then the
You've cut up very bad. Oh dear. Probably like the past 20 seconds. Yeah, I think you're back now. Probably like the past 20 seconds.
Okay. No worries. No worries. So Irenaeus, he wrote a book against heresies and where he's addressing Gnosticism. And I want to pay attention to what he argues the faith of the church is sourced in. He says that his opponents, which again are the Gnostics, thought themselves wiser not only than the presbyters, but even than the apostles. And he argues that the faith of the church was received from the apostles and their disciples. And so the content of what he's teaching, he's claiming, is handed down from the apostles and those who knew the apostles. In Origen's book on First Principles, he writes that the teaching of Christ was transmitted in orderly succession from the apostles and remains in the church to the present day. And so what that tells us, again, is that the teaching of Christ is mediated through what the apostles taught. In Hippolytus's apostolic tradition, the word traditio in Latin actually just means to hand on. So this book, the Apostolic Tradition, actually just means what the apostles handed on. And Hippolytus writes, "It is in this manner that many heresies have grown, namely, they did not wish to affirm themselves of the opinion of the apostles, but they did what they wanted according to their own pleasure." So deviating from the opinion of the apostles is what Hippolytus is arguing is contrary to the apostolic faith. We do not have freedom to disagree with the teaching of the apostles.
Yep.
Now, in the Stromata, written by Clement of Alexandria, he points out that many men who helped him along, he says one came from Syria, the second from Egypt, another in the East, led him to an understanding of who God was. He was blessed by them. And he said they well preserved the tradition of blessed doctrine derived directly from the holy apostles, Peter, James, and John, the sons receiving it from the Father. So what this tells us then is in the consciousness of the early church, the question is, what did the apostles teach? What was the body of teaching they gave to us to communicate to their generations? So on historical grounds, let's try to identify and answer that question. So first, I want to argue this, as it is going to be more plausible that teachings which would conform with, cohere with, or be in harmony with what the soil of Second Temple Judaism would be more likely to go back to Jesus than teachings that don't. So, for example, if someone took the other Paul and put a bunch of Americanisms on his lips, you could probably tell they weren't accurately telling his story, right?
Right.
If I don't know what Australians, I don't know what Americanisms would be relevant here. So to use a different example, if someone were to, let's say they were claiming they were telling you Abraham Lincoln's story, and they put on his lips things we would only say in present day America or in Australia, we could know that that account is dubious. Now, on the other hand, if there's an account that we hear that conforms to something that would be said in that day, we can say, all right, this, while that doesn't prove, is my show okay?
You're cutting out again. All right, I think you're back.
Cool. While that doesn't prove that Abraham Lincoln said those things, it at least adds to the plausibility that he would have said those things. Now, secondly, I'm going to argue that that this unity is seen in the earliest stratum of data that we have from early church history. So, going back to Against Heresies, the sort of structure of Against Heresies is in book 1. Irenaeus is primarily summarizing the Gnostic heresies. In chapters 1 through 8, he gives us a thorough summary of Gnostic beliefs, and he gives a sketch of it in chapter 7. So here was the Gnostic sort of system that I want to just highlight. To Irenaeus, chapters 1 through 7.
You're cutting out.
Everything
cutting out again.
emanates from. Man, I wish I.
This is annoying the heck
Yeah.
out of me. There's nothing on your end you can change up, can you? Maybe even something like default camera quality on StreamYard.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Let me see.
Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully that'll help. A little lower definition, but yeah, hopefully that'll help. Cool.
Okay. Let's give it a go.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you
Cool.
fine.
So in Against Heresies, Irenaeus sketches the Gnostic system, and it goes something like this. There's this sort of one, this supreme invisible being, and this being has divine thoughts of this being self. We could call this being God, just for all intents and purposes. And God's thoughts are generated by God's reflection of himself. Now, these thoughts are called eons, right? So eons are sort of these emanations, these different aspects of God's self-thinking. Some of these are called, like one of them is called the logos, the word. Another is wisdom. Another is epinoia, which is sort of self-reflection. And so there's this whole pleroma, it's called, populated by the thoughts of God. Now, these thoughts are sort of almost living hypostases. They're almost sort of living personal things. So the story of Gnosticism is that Sophia, wisdom, she wants to get actually really close to God in a way that's illicit. And so she tries to get close to God. But as a result, and the sort of as a result clause, there are different ways of sketching that out. But as a result of her failing she is impregnated. And she gives birth to a being called Eel-Debao. And Eel-Debao is understood to be the God of the Old Testament. And in some accounts, he's understood to be the demiurge, sort of the one that creates the material world. But generally, they'll point to Eel-Debao as the God of the Old Testament. So what you'll see in Gnostic teaching is frequent statements that it didn't happen like Moses said. You'll see a rejection of material creation, of the goodness of material creation. You'll see a rejection of the Old Testament narrative because they believe that Eel-Debao, this sort of ill-begotten bastard child, is the God of the Old Testament. Now, how does that differ from the Jewish faith?
Well, how does it not differ?
Yep. Well, and I want to quote Irenaeus, and this is going to be important. This is from Book 2, Chapter 2, Section 5. Irenaeus here does something really interesting. In other books, like in Book 1, Chapter 10, he appeals to the unity of the church. So what the church descended from the apostles is broadly preaching. He does that. But then in this book, in Chapter 2, he uses another strategy just to point out how they're twisting Scripture. And so he says this, and I'll quote him at length. For this is a peculiarity of the preeminence of God, not to stand in need of other instruments for the creation of those things which are summoned into existence. So again, as a side note, God would have created through an eon or Eel-Debao. So he would have created through a logos, which is understood to be sort of this separate thing from him, almost another being that summarizes his thoughts, or Eel-Debao himself. His own word is both suitable and sufficient for the formation of all things, even as John, the disciple of the Lord, declares regarding him, all things were made by him, and without him was nothing made. John 1:3. Now among the all things, our world must be embraced. It too, therefore, was made by his word, as Scripture tells us in the book of Genesis, that he made all things connected with our world by his word. David also expresses the same truth. For he spoke and they were made. He commanded and they were created. I believe that's Psalm 33. Whom, therefore, shall we believe as to the creation of the world? These heretics who have been mentioned that prate so foolishly and inconsistently on the subject? Or the disciples of the Lord and Moses, who was both a faithful servant of God and a prophet? He at first narrated the formation of the world in these words. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and all other things in succession, but neither gods nor angels had any share in the work. And Irenaeus is also pulling that from Isaiah. So in Book 3, Chapter 6, you can see some of his other evidence there. So in Isaiah 45, verse 23, for example, or I believe it's in 45, the Lord declares that he alone made heaven and earth, and he had no help. He stretched out heaven and earth alone. So that tells us something. In Jewish monotheism, Yahweh alone is understood to be the creator of everything. And this stands in contrast to what the Gnostics taught here. Now, in the dialogue with Typhro, Justin Martyr says this really key phrase. So again, the strategy, what we're showing here is that the strategy of these Christians is to show that their teaching is continuous with Old Testament teaching. So he says this to Typhro, who's a Jew that he's trying to convert. And he points out that we consider that we have one God, or we do not consider, nor do we consider, that we have one God and you another, but him only who brought your fathers out of the land of Egypt by a mighty hand and stretched out his arm. Nor have we set our hopes on any other, for there is none, but only on him whom you also have set yours, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So note the strategy there. They're trying to show continuity of their teaching with the teaching of Judaism. Ignatius does the same in his epistle to the Smyrnaeans. Yeah, I always forget how to pronounce that. Ignatius is a bishop, and he's appointed historically by John, and he's a bishop of Antioch. And there's other traditions that point to multiple apostles ordaining him. The universal testimony seems to be he was ordained by an apostle, either John or a group that included John. Now, Ignatius says this: some ignorantly deny him, or rather have been denied by him, being the advocates of death rather than of the truth. These persons neither have the prophets persuaded, nor the law of Moses, nor the gospel, even to this day, nor the sufferings we have individually endured. So note what's going on there. Ignatius is saying that his teaching needs to be persuasive. It needs to connect with the teaching of the prophets, which we see in Josephus, and we actually see in Luke, is a locution to refer to the whole Old Testament. All of the books were considered to have been written by prophets, or you could refer to all of the books sort of by a synodoke, a part whole reference, by referencing the prophets. So Ignatius is wanting to say that his teaching accords with the prophets. Now, again, note the contrast. I'm going to quote here really quick from the Gospel of Sophia. This is a Gnostic text. It's fragmentary, but I think this is worth showing that we don't only have Irenaeus's words for it. We have the Gnostic texts showing teachings that are inconsistent with the sort of Jewish world of the Second Temple that Jesus would have lived and breathed in. So the Gospel of Sophia says this: the perfect Savior said, if you ask about anything, I will tell you. They, who's the they? It's the eons. They created hosts of angels, myriads without number, for retinue and their glory. They created virgin spirits, the ineffable changeable lights, for they have no sickness or weakness, but it is will. Thus the eons were completed quickly in the heavens, and the firmaments in the glory of immortal man and Sophia, his consort. So what's going on there? So this immortal man, from what we can tell from the fragment that we have in the Gospel of Sophia, at least on this account, seems to be the means through which Sophia tried to approach God or something like that. In any case, when she tried to obtain this illicit knowledge, she was impregnated on this account by the immortal man. The immortal man and Sophia, his consort, in the glory of the immortal man and Sophia, his consort. The area from which every eon and the world and those that came afterward took their pattern for their creation of likeness in the heavens of chaos and their worlds, and all nature, starting from the revelation of chaos, where the light that shines without shadow and joy that cannot be described. And then later on, it goes that the arch-begetter is called El Debao, and the arch-begetter is again understood to be the one who sort of orders the material elements. He's the one who creates the material world. So this is from the Gospel of Sophia. Now with the Apocryphon of John, it's another Gnostic text, you have the same story about El Debao, and you have it in a sort of almost more graphic mode in some ways. So here, Sophia, I approach the invisible Spirit, which is again
Oh,
God.
you're cutting out a bit now.
But
You cut out. You cut out for a second there.
how am I doing now?
You're fine now. You're fine now. It went for a long stretch, so I think maybe if it happens again, we'll revisit another solution. But you're good now.
Yeah. Cool. I'm trying to. Yeah. Let's see.
I think you're G now.
Okay. Okay. Am I good now?
Yes, you're good now.
Yeah. Okay, cool. In the man.
You're good now. You're good now.
Okay.
If it happens again, we'll consider another solution.
Cool. In the Apocryphon of John, we have a similar story. Sophia approaches El Debao, and she's impregnated again. And she bears El Debao, who's called the chief ruler. And the text says this: he took great power from his mother, left her, moved away from his birthplace. He assumed command, created realms for himself with a brilliant flame that continues to exist even until now. And then it actually says that El Debao approaches Eve and rapes Eve, and that generates Cain and Abel. And this text also goes on to say that El Debao is understood to be the one who sent the flood. And so it's portraying this, El Debao, as this cruel, evil deity, this maker of chaos, and this offspring of Sophia's idolatry, her illicit attempts to get near to God.
Okay.
Now compare. Yes.
Oh, I was actually. I may as well say it now.
Yeah, go for it.
So you basically your first case being that just from the prior likelihood, the Gnostic conception of Jesus is extremely unlikely, if not impossible, given existing Second Temple Jewish beliefs on it. Now, how would you respond if someone were to come back? And this is actually the thing that Lofton would say himself. How would you respond if a Gnostic were to say, well, Jesus was the exception. He was this new guy. He brought up these new Gnostic teachings. So just because that was the norm around him, it doesn't mean he believed the same things. We believe he taught our things. How would you respond to that kind of an argument from an exception?
Good, great. So then we move on to historical dating of the Gospels themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so we get this idea from the 2nd century that there's this group of Christians trying to show that their teaching is continuous with the teaching of the Old Testament over and against the Gnostics. Now, where did they get this idea? Well, they got this idea from the earliest Gospels that were written. So here then, what we want to do is say, okay, let's compare these streams and these claims that are being made to the earliest documents that we have. So scholars are mostly in consensus that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written before the close of the 1st century. So, and certainly Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written before the close of the 1st century. And most people don't want to date John beyond 100 AD. And that's actually the close, what's postulated as the close of the whole canon. So even Revelation, sometimes the latest date that it gets is sort of 96 AD. I don't know how anyone could possibly know that, but that's sort of the latest date that's assigned to it. So all of the New Testament writings, they're written at the close of the 1st century. How do we know this? Well, we know this both actually because of how the Gospels are being used by some of these immediate successors, and we know this through manuscript data. So, for example, we have a fragment, it's very small, Mark, that dates to the 2nd century, found in Egypt. Now, how did it get to Egypt by that point? Well, it had to have a transmission history to get there. We have a fragment of John, similarly, that dates to about 125 AD. I believe it came from Antioch. I might be wrong about that. But if it went to Antioch, again, think about how long of a process writing and copying was in the ancient world. It wasn't like today where you can just print a paper off a printer and distribute it. It was a very expensive process. You would spend the equivalent of thousands on any given literary work. And to transmit it and to produce copies takes time. So if it's all the way in Antioch, and if we're finding texts in Egypt that early on, that means the actual composition of the document has to date considerably before that.
Yeah.
Now,
I'll personally add as well. 1 second. There's one really good book that I can recommend on this. It's a recent release by Jonathan. I don't know if you have it, Sean, but it's a release by Jonathan Bernier called "Rethinking the Dates in the New Testament." Extremely good book. He basically cuts past the fact, because so many scholarly works on this issue, they just play the game of like, literature reviews, interacting with scholars, super technical, billions of footnotes and all that. But Jonathan, he does interact with scholarship, but he gets right to the meat of it. He just goes right into the data and just deals with that, all the muck of that. And he actually argues for 3 of the Gospels that they've written before AD 60, which is crazy early compared to what a lot of scholars will say. And that likewise, even the Gospel of John was written before AD 70. And so he has some quite persuasive arguments for such early dating in here. And so I highly recommend anyone in this issue interested in it, pick up this book, because this is much better than what anyone can claim about various other Gnostic and otherwise apocryphal gospel texts. And one other factor I'll mention, actually, with respect to are you going to mention the attestation of the Gospels? Or
yes, I was going to mention.
You get to that.
Yeah. So Papias of Hierapolis lived roughly around 140. And he was a bishop actually at roughly around 140. So he actually lived earlier than that. And according to Eusebius, he was discipled by people who knew the apostles. And that makes a lot of sense, right? If he's a bishop already by 40 AD, he's at least 30, 40, right? And so when he was like 10, you would have had living at that time people who knew the apostles. And so Papias writes this: Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately whatsoever he remembered. It was not, however, in the exact order that he related the sayings or deeds of Christ, for he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who accommodated his instructions to the necessities of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a regular narrative of the Lord's saying. Wherefore Mark made no mistake in thus writing some things as he remembered them. For of one thing he took especial care, not to omit anything that he had heard, and not to put anything fictitious into the statements. So what's Papias saying there? Well, he's saying Mark was an interpreter of Peter, and he's conveying Peter's teachings. And so the reason Mark reads like it does, if you read Mark, you'll see and immediately, and immediately, and immediately, is because what Mark's doing is he's summarizing essentially Peter's teachings. Now, are there any internal features of Mark that support that? Well, there actually are. Consider, first of all, that if the gospel writers just want, or if the early church just wanted to make up someone who wrote the gospel. This is a point you'll often hear, for example, from Bart Ehrman. The Gospels are formally anonymous, and the names are more or less random, and we have no idea who wrote the Gospels. Well, here's the problem with that. If you were going to make up a name, why would you go with Mark? What the Gnostic writers do is they go directly with apostles. So they go with Peter, for example, or they go with Thomas. Why would you go with Mark? And in the Gospel, interestingly, we have really interesting historical markers. So Richard Bauckham, in his book Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, points out that there's a Petrine inclusio that starts in Mark chapter 1, verse 16. He's the first disciple that's mentioned. And then in Mark 16, verse 7, he's the last disciple that's mentioned. And so this inclusio sort of brackets all of the narrative action within Peter's activity. It's really interesting. Now, here's some other interesting features of Mark. There's name dropping. So, for example, Salome is mentioned in Mark 16, I believe. She's just name dropped. She's not explained at all. We have no idea who she was. Now, think about this. If you're writing a book for a community and you just name drop someone, right? If I tell you Miley came in like a wrecking ball, right? You know what I'm talking about there.
Yeah.
Because it's part of our communal landscape. I don't have to explain that. But if you had no idea who Miley was, right, and I just name dropped that, you would be scratching your head. It only makes sense to do something like that if the community knows who Mark's talking about. And he does this several times. So, for example, he just name drops Mary Magdalene. There is no explanation in Mark's gospel of who Mary Magdalene is. He just drops her name. Similarly, when he talks about Simon of Cyrene, he calls him the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, why would he point that out unless Mark's community knew who Alexander and Rufus were? There are certain narrative details as well that only function like citation. They add nothing to the narrative. So, for example, in Mark 14, verses 53 through 54, we read the following. And they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together, and Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he was sitting with the guards and warming himself at the fire. That event plays no role in Jesus's sort of interrogation by the chief priests. It's just sort of mentioned. Yep. Why would Mark do that? Of course, because he's indicating his source. He's indicating where he got the story. That's its only purpose for being there. And there are a number of other details you can explore. Baucham's book is really helpful like that. Similarly, with Matthew, Matthew, again, as a name, is an unlikely choice for the book you'd pick. You'd likely want to pick a book in the three, among the three, so Peter, James, and John, and we see that again in the Gnostic texts. We don't see that in the text that the church actually authorized. Luke, similar thing. He's said to be a follower of Paul. And Luke has these similar narrative details as well. So does Matthew, actually, as well. But Luke has very specific narrative details that function as citations. He opens his prologue in the style of a historian. He claims to be delivering what eyewitnesses saw. And then he says certain things. So, for example, when Jesus is teaching in the temple and Mary is offended, Luke points out that Mary treasured these things up in her heart. Why would he do that? What's its purpose in doing? Well, he's, again, indicating his source. He's indicating where he got it. In Acts, which is written as a holistic composition as a part of Luke, it's actually one word, Luke Acts. Acts is sort of its sequel. And in Acts, starting, I believe, in chapter 16, Luke uses the first personal pronoun, we. So he actually indicates that he's part of Paul's journey. Now, some scholars will try to dismiss this as well.
I love seeing the loop-de-loops I've seen with some scholars trying to say, oh, this is just a literary device of like ancient sea journey novels and all that. And it's like, or he actually says we.
Right. Well, and what's interesting is he switches his style there. We don't have an example of the usage of we like that in the ancient world. We just don't. And Luke, when he doesn't include himself in the first half of Acts, he includes himself in the second half of Acts. And so why would he do that if he was just using the word we as this sort of narrative literary device? That doesn't really make sense. Similarly, Luke has details that have been archaeologically sustained, especially in the 20th century. And so we know he's actually a pretty good historian. We have a good reason then to think that it was written by Luke. Now, here's another interesting tidbit, and I hadn't known this until Luke Timothy Johnson pointed this out. If you look at the grammar of 1st and 2nd Timothy, and you compare it with the Gospel of Luke, the vocabulary is very, very similar. So some of the vocabulary sort of idiosyncrasies of Luke come out in 1st and 2nd Timothy. Well, what does the end of 2nd Timothy say? What does Paul, who's at least is historically considered to be the author, what does he say? He says, Luke alone is with me. So if Paul's in prison and he's it would make a lot of sense to have Luke be his scribe to help pen this letter, which then Paul authorizes to be sent. So that lends more credence to this idea that Luke is probably the author of the gospel. So we have good reason to think that. Now, let's think about the Gnostic texts, on the other hand. The Gospel of Thomas, late 2nd century. There's no way it was written by Thomas. And again, there's no way what Thomas taught would have been written by Thomas. So, for example, I believe this is in the Gospel of Thomas, where one of the sayings of Jesus is that for women to enter the kingdom of heaven, they must become male. That's nowhere in the teachings of Jesus. And Paul's declaration in Galatians 3:28 is that all are one in Christ Jesus. so that we all have a right to salvation on the same basis, whether you're a man or a woman, which is namely faith in the Messiah.
And that's coming from a much more solidly established and more attested text than the Gospel of Thomas, because that's actually that's easily one of the key things. If someone was to say, "Oh, why do you accept these Gospels, not these ones?" That's actually one of the key things. Whereas with our canonical Gospels, their attestation is extremely wide and early, even among with respect to the Gospel of John in particular, which is really ironic for certain reasons, even among certain Gnostics. So two Gnostic leaders, Ptolemy and Heraclian, positively attest to the authorship and authority of the Gospel of John. Heraclian in particular wrote an entire commentary on the Gospel of John. And so with various Gnostics, they themselves put themselves into a big rut by affirming the authority of certain documents. Not that just that it was written by John, but that it's authoritative and reflective of Christ's teachings. And so that gives us the opportunity to say, John says this, why are you saying that? And so with many of them, that happens. Whereas with the various Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, or like other fake Gospels and Acts and whatnot, their attestation is very, very locally focused within their specific Gnostic communities, in contrast to the canonical Gospels. So that's really the big difference there.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And now some people will try to dismiss Paul, and not necessarily the Gnostics. Marcion sort of took Paul but then edited him. But some people will try to get around Paul's testimony. Here's why you can't do that. Why you have to take Paul at face value and his letters at face value. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 11, gives a famous creed that Jesus died, was buried, was raised, and that he was seen by Peter and by the 12 and by 500 and by James and then eventually by Paul himself. Now here's what Paul says to the Corinthians: whether it was I or they, so we preached and so you believed. And in 1 Corinthians 1, we learned that people were being idolatrously baptized in the name of Cephas, or at least they were, or rather not baptized. They were claiming to say, I follow Cephas. And so here's the thing. If Paul says whether it was I or they, the people he just talked about, so we preached and so you believed to the Corinthians, that has to mean that Peter and the 12 were there in Corinth. They preached the gospel in Corinth. And so if Paul was teaching something that was discontinuous with what the 12 were teaching, the Corinthians would have known it. Paul would never have said something like that if he was teaching a different gospel than what the 12 disciples were teaching. So what do we learn from Paul? Well, in verses like 1 Timothy or in Colossians 1:15 through 20, we learn that creation is good. We learn that creation is a good gift from the Father. All things are from him, through him, and to him, Romans 11. Colossians 1:15 through 20, all things were created through Christ and for Christ. We learn from the reformulated Shema in 1 Corinthians 8:6 that all things are from God the Father and through the Lord Jesus Christ. And so we learn that this world is God's good created order. That stands in stark contrast to anything we see in the later Gnostic texts. And so then now we have this body of apostolic teaching. In Mark and in Matthew, we see affirmations of the Old Testament, especially in Luke, we see that, where Jesus in Luke 24 condemns the disciples on the road to Emmaus. He says, "Foolish are you for not believing all that the prophets have spoken." And then in the very next verse, he opens up the law and the prophets. So again, he's using that as a cipher for the whole Old Testament. And so Jesus is very much confirming the authority of the Old Testament there and the authority of the God of Israel. Similarly, in John, you see the very same thing where Jesus in John 8:58 claims to be the I am, and everyone knows that that's what he's saying. That's why they pick up stones to stone him. They know that he's identifying himself as the God of Israel. That stands in stark contrast to claiming that the God of Israel is El Dabao. That doesn't sound like the same community. So the earliest documents, then, let's take stock. The earliest documents, which we have established, were in the 1st century. We've established that there's good reason to think that they embody eyewitness testimony. And we know that Paul, who was an apostle, who had direct contact with the 12, was teaching the same things that the Gospels affirm, namely that creation is God's good world, that the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament is one, is the self-same God, that the God of Christians is Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that he is the only God. He's made everything in heaven and on earth. Everything other than him comes from him. That stands in stark contrast to saying that this world was created by a demiurge. The God of the Old Testament is an evil bastard child, and that the one God is sort of invisible, and you need secret knowledge to be rescued from this world. The hope of the New Testament, and this is one of the beautiful theological practical implications. But before I was a Christian, I really thought Christians believed that the final goal of our existence was dying and going to heaven. The hope of the New Testament is in the renewal of creation and the final resurrection of the dead in this embodied mode. That's a strong affirmation of the goodness of creation, and that's lacking in Gnostic texts. And that gives credence to this idea that Ignatius and Papias and Irenaeus are preaching the same faith that we find from the apostles, because we find a coherence between Papias, Irenaeus, Ignatius, and Polycarp and the earliest apostolic texts.
I'd also add for me that the greatest smoking gun of them all, really the most underappreciated one, would definitely have to be the letter of First Clement, because that letter, even with normal scholarship, that's dated to like around 90 AD, so that makes it one of the earliest extra-biblical documents we have. But I believe there's excellent evidence that actually it's written even before the destruction of the Second Temple. I don't know where you lie on that issue, but it very explicitly talks about how there's how the Jewish sacrifices work at the temple, and it talks about them happening in the present tense. And so that, combined with other statements where it says, where the letter says, let's consider men from our own generation who are examples of the faith, and then it immediately raises Peter and Paul and their martyrdom. And so very strong evidence that it was written in the contemporary times of the apostles. And that's key, because I also additionally believe that this is a letter that was collectively commissioned by the collective leadership of Rome, not just Clement, because it talks about in the letter's opening, where it gives the author and the recipient, very standard for ancient epistles. The author it gives is the church that sojourns in Rome. And then that, combined with the ubiquitous use throughout the letter of we say this, we wrote this, we did that, very clearly a collective effort, so which would probably almost certainly include Clement himself. And so this letter, before the destruction of the temple, directly acquainted with the preaching of Peter and Paul. And what does it preach? One in the resurrection of Christ, one in the same, one in the same God of the Old Testament, the authority of Peter and Paul, in addition. What else? Well, basically the core of things which the Gnostics and Marcionites would deny, as well as positively quoting statements either directly from Gospels or from very close, like parallel tradition statements that come from like Matthew, for example, which Marcionites would reject, and basically all of the Gnostics would reject. And so that testimony, combined with the testimony of Ignatius, Polycarp, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, and even the helpful testimony of other Gnostics like Ptolemy and Heraclian with respect to John, and even in a partial sense, Marcion with respect to Paul, all that combined together, you've got an overwhelming case against these sects, because you've got billions of these little small sects where their teachings did, as was accounted in history, their teachings did evolve over time, and it was very, very locally focused over these certain leaders. Whereas here you have tons and tons of global Christian leaders all attesting to one and the same message, and being able to have an account of tracking it back to the apostles and through the apostles back to Christ. So there's really no comparison.
Yeah. And note that this reasoning is historical reasoning, right?
Yes.
So Irenaeus rightly appeals to the unity of the bishops in book 3, preaching one and the same faith, and Gnosticism as an innovation. That's a really good historical argument, right? That's not just an appeal to apostolic succession. Exactly. Although, again, as an Anglican, I believe in apostolic, and especially I'm more on the Reformed Catholic side of things, and lean Anglo-Catholic in some ways. I believe in apostolic succession, but that's not why Irenaeus appeals to it, at least not for its own sake, but because he leverages that to show that the broad church, which has maintained this line of succession, teaches the same thing, and that the Gnostics are an aberration from what the church has taught.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually have that. There's this note taking software I have called Obsidian, which I've just recently got, and I'm basically making it like a comprehensive knowledge library of like sources, personal notes, and all that. Basically everything I learn and study, and just have it all available at fingertips. And so I have looking at I've got some key quotes from Irenaeus against heresies. I may just quote just the one, because this demonstrates what Irenaeus means by apostolic succession and the value that he sees in it. Because again, this is something contra Lofton and certain other Romanists and Easterners. He did not, and other early witnesses did not appeal to apostolic succession, as you said, for its own sake. It wasn't merely because, hey, we can trace our ordinations back to the apostle, and that proves us. Because just when you just think about it, as I said at the beginning, what does that prove? That doesn't really prove anything. They could just say, okay, you got a material succession, and you guys got the teachings wrong. There's nothing that necessitates correctness of teaching, which is why Irenaeus appeals to it not for its own sake, but because of the historical value. And this is what he says. So this is in Against Heresies, Book 3, Chapter 3, Paragraph 1. It is within the power of all, therefore, in every church who may wish to see the truth, to contemplate clearly the tradition of the apostles manifested throughout the whole world. And we are in a position to reckon up those who were, by the apostles, instituted bishops in the churches, and to demonstrate the succession of these men to our own times, those who neither taught nor knew anything like what these heretics rave about. So look at the assumption there. His assumption is that we can trace these teachers, people who taught a certain thing contrary to these heretics, and that's the value of the succession. And continuing on, for if the apostles, this is the key thing. This is explicit right here. Irenaeus is reliant on historical method, basically. For if the apostles had known hidden mysteries, which they were in the habit of imparting to the perfect, apart and privily from the rest, they would have delivered them, especially to those to whom they were committing the churches themselves. For they were desirous that these men should be very perfect and blameless in all things, whom also they were leaving behind as successors, delivering up their own place of government to these men, which men, if they discharge their functions honestly, would be a great boon to the church, but if they should fall away, the direst calamity. In other words, historical method. Good historical method, very successful historical method. And that is the basis upon which Irenaeus then later on accounts the succession of Roman bishops or presbyters, including one of the first ones he'll cite. One of those at the very beginning of the list will be Clement, and then he'll mention Clement's letter and then discuss its content, which is contrary to the Gnostics. Why is he doing that if the content itself is not what matters, but the mere existence of succession? As we see here in that paragraph and throughout the rest of Irenaeus' work following that section, as well as in the succession list itself, the succession is significant because of the historical attestation and memory in those communities of what those teachers taught. Because don't forget, Irenaeus, let's put it in perspective here. He is living around the year 180. And this is quite literally within the time of living memory of people at the time. We can think of an exact parallel for us would be someone living in the 1980s referring to what people said, let's say at the very beginning of the 20th century or at the very end of the 19th century. That's actually, if you're living in the 80s, that's actually quite a reasonable thing to do. You would have contact with people who either directly knew those people from the late 19th century, or those people who were directly in contact with them. Which mistakes can creep in, sure, but on the whole, that's a very, very close and reliable connection of information. And so Irenaeus isn't just talking about the people at the very back of the list, like Clement and Anicetus and the apostles themselves, but even people close to those times. And the closer you get, the more strong you get with the living memory. And so that's why Irenaeus' argument works. It's because they are so close within living memory. They can account who the successors of the apostles are, and within that living memory, what they taught. That's the value of Irenaeus' method.
Yeah, that's great.
Yep, that's basically that. You got more to do? You got more to say, or is that largely?
Yeah, I mean, I think the last thing to say is, and to acknowledge, our case assumes the historical reliability of the resurrection and the case for the resurrection. That's okay. They're really good videos that you can watch on the evidence for the resurrection. I would point you to that. But once you have that, once you have this idea that Jesus is raised from the dead and he's appointed apostles to authoritatively teach his message, then this argument, I think, enables us to establish the apostolic teaching as embodied in what we have in the New Testament, as opposed to what you might have in the Gnostic texts. I think that's all. Yeah, and that's, yeah, I don't have anything more to add.
Yeah, absolutely. And all this just taken with the basic necessary historical presupposition that unless proven otherwise, witnesses are generally reliable.
Yeah.
When we take on that presupposition, the case is decisive. And the only reply I can potentially see from a hyperskeptic is say, oh, but why don't you then presume the reliability of like the Gnostic witnesses, for example, like Ptolemy, like Marcion and all that? And I'd say, with respect to logical progression of argument, I can do that. I could approach Marcion for the first time, see what he says, assume his general reliability of witness, which is actually not very easy to do because we don't have much. We don't even have much by way of what kinds of historical claims he was making. Likewise with many other Gnostics, because actually many Gnostics didn't seem to appear per se to make great Gnostic claims. They were much more focused on like, oh, look at me, I'm a prophet and all that stuff. And I've got the enlightenment from the apostles. But even from those who do, like with Ptolemy in his letter, for example, he claims his teachings, his method of interpreting the law of Moses. That's what the letter to Flora does in a very Gnostic fashion. He claims that this is teaching received from the apostles by apostolic succession. And so we can take that at the first logical outstep. Okay, let's be charitable. Let's assume, unless we can demonstrate otherwise, that he's wrong. And here's what we can do. Earlier figures: Ignatius, Justin Martyr, Clement of Rome, Paul himself, Polycarp, Papias. The list goes on. All figures earlier than Ptolemy. And if we're using the same criteria by which to say that Ptolemy lived at this time, we can use that same criteria likewise to establish these guys are all earlier. And they also argue with much more specifics the nature of their reception of the teaching from the apostles. When we look at all them, it's saying something completely contrary to what Ptolemy says or to what Marcion says. And so we can take at the first outset, we can trust them. But then once we compare it to all this other data, we find, okay, they're actually bunk. So it's not actually, so this isn't even just me saying or us saying we assume the reliability of the apostolic guys and we assume the unreliability of the Gnostics. No. This is doing the same. We can take them both charitably. We can assume both their reliability at the outset, and then we weigh what they both say. And with respect to the evidence of the apostolic faith, we got, and then with the non-apostolic faith, we got in comparison. And this is made even worse by the fact that these various sects all claimed very mutually exclusive things, including even the Valentinians with Marcion, because I believe Marcion actually largely came from the Valentinian school, and yet he's claiming very different things. Like he basically drops the idea of this hidden esoteric knowledge given by the apostles, and he largely does a kind of standard "my teaching is from the scriptures" kind of deal. And so we can see that with the vast divides of the various Gnostic schools and how localized they were versus the global reach of the apostolic faith, that also is quite decisive. That's what I'd say about that.
Yeah. And to address a claim I often see from, I'll just two claim because I don't want to just bash Catholics, but a claim that I often see from within Roman Catholic communities. But aren't you still appealing to the church? Well, of course, but an agnostic could do that, right? We're appealing to them through the methods of historical investigation. On the other hand, an atheist can try to, and I believe, I forget who did this. It might have been Paula Fredrickson. Maybe it wasn't her. There was someone who tried to date the Gospel of Thomas to like the first century.
Oh, yeah.
The major problem with that is that, first of all, the Gospel of Thomas uses phrases that we really only find in the late 2nd century. So Judas Thomas is a designation that we find in the Syriac church for Thomas that really only comes up. Yeah, there we go. Someone's mentioned John Dominic Cross, and he tries to do that.
Yeah.
So in the Syriac church, Judas Thomas is mentioned. But then secondly, we don't really find someone like Ignatius addressing there being writings, at least formal writings, like the Gospel of Thomas that he's going after.
Yeah. We don't have any of them. That's the thing. Because if just one ancient Christian author didn't mention the authorship of the gospel, that'd be one thing. But if none of them do, that's an issue.
Right. So that's really interesting. And again, we can tell that from the sort of soil of ideas that are being communicated in the Gospel of Thomas, it doesn't originate on Palestinian soil. So that tells you something again about its proximity to the events it's purporting to convey to us.
Yep, many such issues. Even the best skeptical scholars that out the Bauer thesis end up falling back on the four Gospels as the best historical sources for Jesus. Yep, 100% true, 100% true.
Yep.
I don't know anyone who's really used the Gnostic Gospels for any historical research on Jesus or the world around him, because especially the Gospel of John, that's in more recent years been used quite a bit and vindicated quite a bit by like pre-temple destruction archaeology, which is very, very significant. And I don't know any Gnostic Gospels have it. Maybe there's like, well, they can certainly tell us details about the communities in which those texts were used, certainly. But with respect to the life of Jesus itself, I don't know anyone who's actually using the Gnostic Gospels to that degree. One thing I'll read as well, because this is something I do also want to show. Because again, this is very widely applicable, including to skeptics as well. But I'll also apply it with Romanists and Easterners who, again, the ones who will try to say like, oh, but the historical stuff, there's so uncertainty in the historical data. So how can you know this or that or whatever? And I just say to them, look, A, our case, we demonstrated this, but also B, your own church fathers, our church fathers, all the earliest ones, all of them appeal to historical witness, not to some infallible charism in a present leader, but to the historical witness they give. I've already read Irenaeus himself. Then I can also read from Clement of Alexandria's Stromata in book 7. Is that book 7? Yeah, book 7, chapter 17. And he, after actually listing out the alleged successions of some of the heretical sects, because some of them actually did claim succession from the apostles. After that, he says the following: "From what has been said, then, it is my opinion that the true church, that which is really ancient, is one, and that in it those who, according to God's purpose, are just, are enrolled. For from the very reason that God is one and the Lord one, and that which is in the highest degree honorable is lauded in consequence of its singleness, being an imitation of the one first principle, in nature of the one then is associated a joint heritage, the one church, which they strive to cut asunder into many sects. Therefore, in substance and idea, in origin, in preeminence, we say that the ancient Catholic Church is alone collecting as it does into the unity of one faith, which results from the peculiar testaments, or rather the one testament in different times by the will of one God through one Lord, those already ordained who God predestined, knowing before the foundation of the world that they would be righteous." And actually earlier before this is the better case, where just before this section I read, Clement says, "Such being the case, it is evident from the high antiquity and perfect truth of the church that these later heresies and those yet subsequent to them in time were new inventions falsified from the truth." So in other words, an explicit appeal to early historical testimony. That's Clement's method. That's Irenaeus's method. That's everybody we see in these early periods. And even much later on, the church fathers, they assume that they don't have this Cartesian view of historical data where, oh, well, what if this is this case? This could be the case. Therefore, it's unreliable. It's uncertain. Because that's a very I have to raise as well. Excellent work of history, historical method book by Keith Winshuttle, an Australian historian, The Killing of History. Largely a big critique on postmodernists and historiography and literary criticism. And he basically addresses the attitude where people say, oh, well, it's not absolutely certain that this thing is the case, that this source is reliable. It could be this, it could be that. And he basically says, look, the appeal to like what could be the case is meaningless unless you can actually come up with some solid reasons why it actually isn't the case. So merely saying it could be the case or it could be that, it's not really meaningful unless you actually have some data to back that up. So yeah, that's what I'd say with what me and Sean here are doing, and even many well-learned Roman Catholics and Easterners who don't buy into this pop level stuff. We're doing what the early church does. We're appealing to historical testimony, not merely to, oh, well, my bishop can trace himself back to Paul, which itself relies on historical testimony, but let's ignore that. We're not just doing that. We are doing what the early church did. You anything else you want to say or anything, or do you want to move right into Q&A? Or
let's move into Q&A.
All right, let's do it. People, drop your questions in the chat. There's surprisingly few from what I've seen. There's like one that's not very relevant. But people, drop your questions into the chat right now while Luke is here. We have a decent amount of time. not super relevant, but I'll just look at this now. Did you hear about Dr. Fork having his associate researcher position stripped? Off topic.
No.
Yeah. Basically, he said some naughty things about this female skeptical scholar, and basically saying, look, a lot of people follow her stuff not because of the quality of it, but because she's hot. He used the phrase "theology by cup size," and he's not. It's not like that. But they like to portray that as like he was being misogynistic. How dare he? Which he wasn't. He wasn't saying something about her, but how a lot of people receive her and why a lot of people follow her. Which, look, is he right or is he not? And of course, all the atheist content makers and scholars like Dan McClellan all came out of the woodwork to kind of dogpile on him and cancel him, and it's pretty cringe. But yeah, Dr. Fork, he's a tough nut. He's not taking it lying down. He's got some stuff in the works.
I will say, I do think that. So to give an example of how this happens on the egalitarian side, right? My wife and I once wrote. We both met at Wheaton College, and we both wrote a paper, and for our school newspaper on complementarianism. Now, egalitarians would also come up to Sophia and say, okay, well, you're just following, Sean, you haven't thought through this, or essentially you're just simping, or pick me girl or whatever. Now here's the thing, right? That's really dismissive of her ideas. And they didn't do that to me. They did that to her. I do think there is, and, it'd be interesting to dialogue about sort of political theology. Because, I do think there's something to that of if a professor is belittling ideas from another person because of their gender, I think that's deeply problematic. It doesn't take someone seriously in their own right.
The issue is that he didn't do it because of her gender per se, but because she's actually a decent looker. That's the thing. So he himself interacts with very positively in other circumstances with many female scholars. His particular problem with this one is that he genuinely believes her ideas are really bad and bunk, and so from that he has the genuine observation that from what he sees with many people, the reason why she's brought on so much, because she's also a TV presenter where she's also brought on TV, like I think BBC quite a bit. Her name is Francesca Stavrokopoulou. And that in TV and TV presentation, looks do actually matter. And so he sees, combined with his belief that her views are really crap, her scholarship's really crap, combined with the fact that she's a good looker, he made the honest observation that, hey, I think a lot of people follow her because of her looks. And look, whether he's right or wrong, that's an honest claim. You can't say misogyny from that. It's not, he's not even doing it because she's a woman. You just got to see basically what he said and then see how a lot of people are spinning it. It's pretty silly. But anyway, that's off topic. Someone said this absolutely silly comment where they said the other Paul said KFC is the worst. See, that's how you can know that something's not from me if I say KFC is the worst, because KFC is my. I know it sucks in the United States, but it's a religion here in Australia.
Wow. I like popcorn chicken. That's pretty good.
Oh, I love popcorn chicken so much. It's good stuff. Does this presentation have the noose asking for a friend?
The noose?
Yeah. Because there's a whole meme of like Eastern Orthodox online apologetics author bros and that, how they'll say like, oh, you don't have the noose, you don't have the noose of Christ, and so like you're enlightened, and they just dismiss you from that. It's a very, very common thing. Absolutely hilarious. Oh man. Let's see. I think Provision's perspective are just doing a rebuttal on TAP. Yeah, their thing's about to premiere, or maybe it has right now, and they're in response to me and another guy, because we made some critical comments on their presentations on like Calvinism and that. Yeah. It's interesting stuff.
I mean, it's Provision is it's pretty shocking. They're essentially semi-Pelagians because they do deny prevenient grace, and so they're even, they're outside of classical Arminianism. They're outside of what the Catholic Church has affirmed and what the East has affirmed historically, and so that's that's an interesting place to be.
Yep, indeed. It gets it's fun interacting with them, I'll say that. Have you seen MT Milton Thomas Wagner on Icons yet? Yes, I have. And the two perspectives, because he gave a recent tweet. He just gave a tweet about like his conclusions on the Icons issue. One, historically, very respectable when he says that, look, they weren't doing icon veneration, the apostles and all that. Even the Second Council of Nicaea relied on a lot of forgeries. The only problem, though, is that I do genuinely think that this is irreconcilable with the historic claims of the Roman Church and even of like the United Church, which they claim to be the continuation of. I think that's where the big issue is, because as Craig Trullia puts it in a good way, that the Newman hypothesis on development is internally consistent, but not consistent with their historical claims with respect to doctrine and that and practice.
I have a paper under review called Sola Apostolica, and I researched Newman quite a bit. What's interesting about Newman's perspective, at least in that book, is it's not necessarily distinctively Roman Catholic, what he outlines. Now, you can use it, definitely, and of course he did, and other Roman Catholics used it to support Roman Catholic claims, but it's not inherently conducive to Roman Catholic authority. And I think what you can, as the other Paul mentioned, and as Gavin Ortland has pointed out, Truth Unites, there are genuine instances of magisterial reversal. And, at some point, that's going to be something I'll want to document on my channel, just to go through the instances and the evidence for there being clear magisterial reversals.
Yeah, 100%. A lot of the excuses they give for that can be very fun to watch. Is this Francesco Stavrocoppolo you're talking about? Yeah, that's the one. Provisionism is semi-Pelagian. Agreed. I'd heard the Orthodox people saying noose as noose and wondering what kind of Mason rites they're talking about. There's some Mason entry thing with a noose anyway. It was odd to hear. LeMayo. Oh dear, no. I do like doing those puns as well with noose. It can be kind of funny. Oh, here we go. Anglican Aesthetics. Do you agree that egalitarian's method of dealing with everything is a modern form of Gnosticism? Ooh.
Okay, yeah. So here we go. There would have been a few years ago. I think I would have said yes. Here's my problem with how this claim gets used, and this happens in all sorts of circles, right? Someone will point to, let's say, someone like John Piper, emphasizing the joy of heaven and the joy of contemplation, and they'll say, okay, well, that's Gnosticism because that's just so intellectualist, and that's a really that's a problematic thing to say. Or one might say, on the other hand, the over intellectualist, quote unquote, stream in certain Reformed streams that you might have, or in analytic philosophy, that's Gnosticism. And so my problem is that Gnosticism it's a particular system, and that's not to say we can't identify overlaps of ideas, but the problem with, for me at least, any history of ideas is that it tends to be really speculative, and more likely you might have modern egalitarianism rooted in ideas coming out of the Enlightenment. It's difficult for me to say that ideas in the Enlightenment were rooted in Gnosticism. Does it have similarities to Gnosticism? Absolutely. In terms of there were at least certain streams of Gnostics that promoted androgyny, and so is that very similar to modern Gnosticism? Yes. But I don't think it is a modern form of Gnosticism. And the unhelpful thing I've come to think about using that label is that it obscures the conceptual tools we actually need to use to address egalitarianism.
Yeah, 100%. That's why you got to be really precise and actually demonstrate why you'd use a label. Like the perfect example would be why we would say that provisionist perspective are semi-Pelagian. It's not just because we say, the semi-Pelagians, they denied our specific form of grace, and provisionist perspective, they deny our specific conception of grace. Therefore, they're saying, no. There could be still key differences. But we would say that because when we look at what the provisionists say, and then what historical semi-Pelagians and, straight up Pelagians would say, there is meaningful contact. There's very meaningful contact. And so such a label can be justified. But again, that only comes because you've done the good hard work and study beforehand.
Well, yeah, just one more quick thing on that question. I will say a lot of egalitarians, and this has happened at TEDS, we have a mix of complementarians and egalitarians studying in the same space. The thing I've noticed, even though I disagree pretty strongly, is that a lot of them are actually keen on affirming the goodness of the female body. They really want to do that, and so that's actually a much more fruitful place of dialogue because we can affirm as broadly complementarians, if we're going to use that label, we can affirm that there's a distinctive goodness to the female body, and we can actually articulate something about that. That's something egalitarians, a lot of them are craving. And so you can actually start to build bridges rather than just saying, oh, that's just Gnosticism and you're tending towards heresy. That's just not as helpful dialogically.
Yep, I 100% agree. 100% agree. How do papers split the historical reasons from the conclusions of a council? We don't do that with scripture. That's an excellent point, I'd say, because with Nicaea too, look, if I could grant the reasonableness of that, kinda, if a council was just making some random historical claim about something that's unrelated to the actual definition of the dogma itself, even then there could be a bit of an issue of like, where do you get this promise of like this level of infallibility for this, but not that even that can be a bit of an issue. But I could otherwise grant that it's not a big issue if they make an unrelated historical claim and they're wrong in it. I do think there's a big problem when they say there's no protection of historical claims, period, because Nicaea 2 doesn't just say, hey, venerating icons, it's a dogma. Oh, by the way, fun historical facts, not really essential, but fun historical fact, the apostles did the same. Anyway, venerate icons. They said, no, we do this because this is the faith of the apostles. This is the faith of the fathers. That is the fundamental core reason of that. And if they are historically, they provide the basis for that historical claim with their evidences and quotations and that. And if that can be falsified, then a foundational reason for the dogmatization of the veneration of icons is underwritten. And if that can be overturned, how does that not affect the conclusion itself? That's something which I think, it does not work. This thing of William, as I remember seeing it in William Ott, Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma, where he basically says the protection of a council pertains to its conclusions, not necessarily the reasons underlying it. To which I say, no, I'm sorry, that's just ridiculous, and it doesn't gel with the historical claims of councils either.
Yeah, well, and think about how authority works and what the claim of the magisterium is. So authority in any given domain, right? So like, let's say the medical profession comes to some sort of conclusion on what a virus is and does, right? I trust that authority, and that authority gives me a reason, which is why the consent of the church matters. Tradition has an evidential weight to it. But importantly, I can also then press into that consensus. The authority sort of gives me, as a layperson, a reason to trust it. But authority isn't a shield for professionals to use from which they can hide behind and mask the underlying reasoning, right? You can, in theory, press into the underlying reasoning and even disconfirm conclusions or see that the reasoning is solid or whatever, right? And the claim of the magisterium is that, and you can see this in De Verbum, Francis Sullivan's book on the magisterium is great. It's really helpful in understanding it, as well as Avery Cardinal Dulis's book on the magisterium. What their claim is that they're expositing. They don't add to the apostolic deposit. And some Protestants actually get this wrong. Rome does not claim to be able to add to the apostolic teaching. That's really interesting. So if they're only an expositor of the apostolic teaching, they're only saying what it means, right? Then in theory, even if they want to say we have authority to do so, it's like, okay, well, maybe, and I think, the consent of the bishops that functions in this evidentiary capacity, but I can also then press into that reasoning, and I can examine the reasons for that. So to give a concrete example, Apostolica Curae in the late 19th century was Rome's authoritative ex cathedra declaration that Anglican orders are invalid. As an Anglican, I take an issue with that. Take a very strong issue with that. Now, here's what's interesting. They base that conclusion off of bad historical reasoning. And I'm going to do a video unpacking more of this because it actually ends up turning into an argument against the infallibility of the magisterium.
Yeah.
And what they do is they claim that the Edwardine ordinal ordained priests in such a way that excluded the function of offering the Eucharist as a sacrifice. Now, Anglicans believe it is a sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving, right? And so we actually don't think it's a mere symbol, or we're not Zwinglians. Now, if and the claim is that, well, that was where apostolic succession was broken. Now, in the Anglican Church's response, Sapius Officio, they pointed out that, well, hold on, if we use let's just use those standards. If we use those standards, right, and they're going to say, well, the ordinal didn't ordain priests to offer up the Eucharist as a sacrifice in any sense because it lacks particular words. Well, the ordination rites in the apostolic tradition and Hippolytus and the early church ordination rites that Rome herself used lacked those same words. So the Edwardine ordinal is actually capturing earlier words. Now, it's true under Elizabeth, certain words get added back in to clear up misconceptions about what the English church was trying to teach. But the intent there was exactly the same as the older rites. And so if our orders are disqualified on the basis of lacking certain words, so would Rome's be. And that's untenable, clearly, for them. Now, the way around this in my dialogue with Roman Catholics has been, well, maybe they can just say, well, the conclusion was just right, and maybe the reasoning is wrong. But that's really problematic, right? Because the conclusion is based.
Because there's the historical. This is historical investigation 101. It's an assumption. There's a thing of cause and effect, and so if the cause itself is falsified, the effect can't follow unless you can find another cause. But they can't, because this is one static proclamation based on certain causes. And when you find that, hey, those causes are falsified, the effect can't follow. How can the decision stand if the reasons themselves are falsified?
And one more quick thing with that. Now, one could say, a Roman Catholic could say, well, we don't intend to offer it up as a propitiatory sacrifice in the sense that
I was thinking that,
it gains sort of temporal merit, which accrues to our account. And it's like, okay, well, that's true, but then neither does the East. The East rejects the system of merit as well. And we do believe that the Eucharist communicates and affects the forgiveness of sins by mediating the presence of Jesus and facilitating a true participation in his body and blood. Now, if that's the case, and if the East doesn't, that's very similar to what the East believes. And if the East rejects the system of merit, but Rome accepts Eastern orders, well, then by the same logic, they'd have to accept ours. So there's a really deep inconsistency there. And actually, in the 1920s, the Patriarch of Constantinople did accept our orders until in the 1970s. We were actually almost in full communion, interestingly, until the 1970s, when the Episcopal Church ordained a woman to the priesthood. And then communication broke down.
Episcopalians ruining everything as usual. Unbelievable. That's fascinating. Have you ever done a show or content on Apostolica Curae?
I'm intending to. Yeah, I've written about it, but I haven't. I actually did a video on it while I was doing a walk, but like on my dog, and so it's like really bad quality. It's like my scrappy phone camera. So I'm gonna re-record it.
Fair enough. What do you think of that? Do you just want to do that solo, or do you want to do another collab on that? Because that's something I want to do. I'd be happy to do a collaboration. Yeah. Sweet. Yeah, I'm keen. Let's book that in sometime. Then we'll definitely talk afterwards. All right. Yeah, I'm not sure about this, but at least can you agree that female preachers' dominancy is what egalitarians share with Gnosticism, as Gnosticism also relies stronger on women's spirituality than male? No, I'd say no. You're thinking of the Montanists. That was a more Montanist thing. I don't know strands of Gnosticism that did that.
Yeah, and we do have to be right. So even with those we strongly disagree with, we got to strive to be charitable and to understand what they're saying. Egalitarians don't want to say female spirituality is stronger than male spirituality. In their view, they don't want to say men shouldn't be ordained to the priesthood or to the presbytery. They just want to say women also should be. That's a different claim, right? And now in their mind, that's sort of a claim of equality. And the problem then is sort of this, as Paul, I think, really well put, that's a kind of spiritual transgenderism, or spiritual androgyny at minimum. But that said, they want to try to say that the spirit, this is the way of showing that our spirituality is equal, which I disagree with that claim, but that's the claim they're making.
Yeah, that's right. We can say that they share a conclusion on an issue, but they're coming at it from different ends.
Mm-hmm.
It's similar to when I did my first stream actually with Craig Truly a long time ago. We both denied the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, but our reasons for doing so are actually very different. So that's an important thing to recognize. A mere coincidence of ideas doesn't prove like common root. Because what's the term? Convergence. That's a real thing. Convergence.
Yeah.
The U.S. Supreme Court only interprets the U.S. Constitution and associated writings with determining if laws are unconstitutional or not, but then they veer off wildly from what is written. Yeah, I think the U.S. Supreme Court's a really beautiful example of the problem of having an absolute authority that interprets a document, and to say that the individual people or lesser authorities are not allowed to go against it, because he had the U.S. Supreme Court demonstrably wrong multiple times. Even their own system with the fact of reversals of Supreme Court opinions proves that. And so you, just like with Holy Scripture, you can't have an absolutist system of one organization having a carte blanche over the right interpretation of Scripture. 100% agree with that. 100%.
Now, I will say Rome's claim is that there's a charism that protects them as interpreters. Now, the way we can show that they're wrong is by just pointing to, I think, these magisterial reversals.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I think that's I think we can show this to the similar problem with that, because then when I confront at least, and I think you've seen the same, Romanists with very clear and blatant changes in belief and policy for Rome, they'll very often either go to extreme stretches of interpretation, or they'll just try to do the whole, you're not allowed to question the change or something like that because this is the magisterium. At which point we can say, well, here we have the Supreme Court doing the same thing, and look at how that's working for the U.S. people. So it's a big problem either way when naked authority is put over actual truth, really. Took them a while to figure out they were wrong. Can the Pope say, Councillor Trent was just wrong in so much? I mean, theoretically, it could say, even in their own system, theoretically, they could say there's a bunch of things that aren't right. So, I mean, you never know.
So, in terms of the dogmatic definition, could is in terms of, is it a historical possibility? Sure.
Yeah.
In terms of what that would do, that would be devastating theologically. Unthinkably devastating theologically. Namely because the Council of Trent is giving just a series of dogmatic definitions. At the very end of each session, you can find we define, declare, etc. The language of very, very infallibly high authority. So that would be really problematic. And so Rome is important for Protestants to know. I think especially when we think about justification. I know this is a slight tangent, but when we think about justification, Rome commits itself, even though there is some overlap, a significant overlap over how we think about initial justification. There is a lot of overlap, and praise God for that. That Regensburg, I might do the show on that. There's so many things that I want to cover. But Regensburg, it was an attempt at reconciliation between Protestants and Roman Catholics in the 16th century. It almost succeeded, but then eventually failed. Luther rejected, the compromises and then Rome rejected the compromises. In any case, we have a lot of overlap there, but Trent commits the Roman system to the system of merit. And so, in my future sort of interactions on justification, I want to sort of address that system of merit being, the fundamental parting of the ways.
Yeah, I think it's going to be, with respect to that historical question of what Francis could say, I think the Francis pontificate and whoever follows him, since he's basically stacking the College of Cardinals, this is going to, honestly, I think the potential of just one major cataclysmic error on the part of the Roman magisterium is more likely now than ever because of the fundamental worldview change with the Francis pontificate, even before him and then going after him. I think because they're being very blatant with their things of being more open and to reform and opening up to other social issues. I think it's only a matter of time before something so blatantly erroneous happens that there's a real mass exodus, at least in the trad side, from Rome. So I think that's something to keep an eye on. A mere coincidence of ideas doesn't prove a common root, bro. Apply the same logic to provisionism. We did actually. I explicitly said that someone who would point to provisionists and say, "Oh, look, they deny a reformed idea of grace, and so did the Pelagians. Therefore, they're the same." No, that's not. You actually have to go deeper, and that's why we would say provisionists are at minimum semi-Pelagian, because they do share very core assumptions with respect to the doctrines of grace. So no, we do apply the same standard. We don't just throw out the semi-Pelagian thing willy-nilly.
Right. The sense in which we're claiming that they're semi-Pelagian is the sense that they're denying the initial movement of grace on the heart. Right. So like a provisionist will say, well, yeah, God initiates because he gives the gospel. Here's the thing. Even Pelagius affirmed that.
Yes, that's right.
That wasn't the issue. The issue at the Council of Orange was the work on the heart and the heart's inability to respond. And this is why Arminians are orthodox. It's an option within Orthodox, even though I disagree with Arminianism. It's still within the tent, because the affirmation of Arminianism is that we do need a work of grace on the heart to be able to respond to God. That's sort of defined as bare minimum. Provisionism denies that. God's initiating movement in the heart to undo sin. That's a huge problem, and that's what theologically puts them in the semi-Pelagian camp.
Yes, that's right. And that basically answers this comment as well. We're not just appealing to a mere coincidence. There's actually meaningful overlap. And that's why we could say, because I initially would say they're full Pelagian, but at least from what I've looked online, I haven't looked at primary sources, but even I wouldn't say, if assuming what I've heard is right, I wouldn't say that they're full Pelagian, because I think one of the central teachings of Pelagius is that sin wasn't actually universal, that there were many instances of people without sin. Whereas provisionist perspective, they, as far as I've seen, and Leighton Flowers, they do grant that all are affected by sin. And so I'm being consistent, and I'd say, okay, I couldn't consider them a full Pelagian because that's a key component of Pelagius system, but we can consider them semi-Pelagian because semi-Pelagians grant the universality of sin, but then they also say that there is no initial movement on the heart by the Holy Spirit with respect to regeneration, and that the grace of God itself, like Pelagius, is simply the giving of the gospel message. That's semi-Pelagianism. That's what they affirm. And so, yeah, there's no fallacy, there's no error there. Goy for Jesus, good to see you, King. Good to see you. Yeah, I guess either we can wait for a couple more questions, or if not, any final comments on your part?
Yeah. Well, I hope this was helpful. If you do have, we might encounter more and more people just as time goes on, and people are disenfranchised with like institutional religion. People who try to appeal to Gnostic writings. I hope this is helpful in equipping you to be able to respond well to some of these issues. A book recommendation, and this is sort of the last thought on my own mind, that I'd really want to put forward would be like Richard Bauckham's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, the most recent edition. It's really helpful. It's really, really helpful in affirming the presence of eyewitness testimony, because you will have more and more. I mean, other. I don't know if you ever watch Apologia's channel.
I do, yeah.
Yeah. So you have a lot of.
Wait, you said Apologia,
Apology, like. Or I forget, like he's anti-apologist.
Yeah, I remember. I don't watch him much. He's
You have a lot of people who will use this anonymity argument, or like, well, we have no way of knowing if the Gospels is recorded eyewitness testimony. That book is worth investing in, and its arguments I think really do substantively work.
Yeah, that's right. And I've even tried to find online like how unbelievers, skeptics, and that respond to the book. And there's a lot of copery. There's a lot of, well, it could be this or could be that. You don't have this absolute Cartesian certainty about this, therefore your claim's bunk. So yeah, it's pretty funny stuff. And actually, really good article. I forgot to bring it up earlier, but I did want to raise it. There is an excellent article by Simon Gathercole called the Alleged Anonymity of the Gospels. Basically, just a one big one-stop shop of the first and second century testimonies with respect to the authorship of the Gospels, which it only goes for explicit citations of Gospel authorship. It doesn't include the many references and citations of Gospel texts which otherwise don't mention the authors, even though one could say that it would be significant if, for example, Polycarp directly quoted Matthew or Luke, which he did. And one could give like a kind of an inductive argument that this is very unlikely if he didn't know the provenance of that gospel. So Gathercole doesn't even include those witnesses. So it's only explicit witnesses. At the end of it, he has a chart right here of the attestations of the different gospels in all these different sources from the first and second century. And especially if you look at the Gospel of John, that is a ridiculously strong attestation. So highly recommended article if people want to find it. Again, the alleged anonymity of the Gospels. But then also there's a Gathercole very recently, August last year, actually released a very big tome that I saw at my local Christian bookshop called The Gospel and the Gospels, which is basically the top of the description itself says a robust scholarly defense of the distinctiveness of the canonical Gospels, which is pretty awesome. And I even flipped open to one little bit when I was at the bookshop, and he basically showed how the citations of the 4 canonical Gospels, like the number of citations in early testimonies, are unparalleled with any other apocryphal gospel. So very interesting stuff. So highly recommend those resources. I recommend the Jesus of the Eyewitnesses. I've got it as well. Very, very good. Just don't take skeptic claims for granted. Don't just let them define the terms of the debate, that their skepticism must be satisfied for you to have a good case. Again, you can say, why should we grant your skepticism? Why should we, on what basis are you challenging this testimony? Because again, we have to grant for basic historiography and basic human life that human witnesses, when they are making claims, are generally reliable. And so if you're gonna apply a hyper-skepticism where it's not warranted, that doesn't end anywhere, and our life won't work. So challenge these people when they make not that you can dismiss any claim of skepticism. There can be warranted skepticism, and you should answer that. But otherwise, learn to recognize when there is really unwarranted skepticism, and then be able to recognize that and just say, why do I need to answer that? Why is that skepticism warranted? You should prove your skepticism. So yeah, I hope that's very helpful for people. Sean, any last minute plugs?
Yeah, so my channel, Anglican Aesthetics, again, I'm going to be putting out some more material on that channel. And there I really want to go. The purpose, again, won't be to just bash other, like Roman Catholics or whatever. The reason I address those things is to establish ecumenicism, because what I'm hoping the heart of the channel to be is a lens, a helpful lens given to you through which you can see God's beauty in all things. That's the hope. And so I'll be doing more things on theological aesthetics there as well. So be expecting that.
Excellent. I can't wait for that, King. I haven't learned or read or watched a lot of aesthetics, so I'm keen to hear what you have to say about that. Well, Sean, thank you so much for coming on. This is an excellent collab. I think, God willing, this will be very, very useful for many people. And if people have questions or more deeper specifics on what we've talked about, or any more recommendations of books and sources in that, hit either of us up. Even comment in the comments below, and we can definitely hit you. 1+ subscriber. There you go, Mr. Sean. People definitely subscribe to Sean. He's got some excellent content out there. Mate, thank you so much for coming on.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Excellent. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so much for watching. This has been Sean Luke of Anglican Aesthetics, and this has been The Other Paul. I hope you all have a lovely day or evening. God bless.